Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the fourth APLD webinar of 2014. Special thanks to our Education Committee, Robert Kazam, Webinar Committee Chair, and Vanessa Gardner-Nagel, Communications and Outreach Chair, for the coordination of today's webinar. I'd also like to thank APLD's exclusive platinum sponsor, Monrovia, for their support of the organization, and also recognize our gold, silver, and bronze sponsors. We will be with you shortly. Once again, I would like to thank our Education Committee, Robert Kazam, Webinar Committee Chair, and Vanessa Gardner-Nagel, Communications Outreach Chair, for the coordination of today's webinar. I'd also like to thank APLD's exclusive platinum sponsor, Monrovia, and also recognize our gold, silver, and bronze sponsors. Our gold sponsors are Bartlett Tree Experts, Dynascape Software, Genesis 3, and Nemetschek Vectorworks. Silver sponsors, the Davy Tree Expert Company and Proven Winners. Bronze sponsors, FX Luminaire, Portica Insurance and Employee Benefits, and Garden Design Magazine. Please support our sponsors as they allow us to bring programs like this one to you at a very reasonable cost. If you didn't already read the webinar housekeeping items, please note the following. If you have any difficulties hearing or viewing the webinar, please contact Citrus by phone at 1-800-424-8749. If you would like to ask the speaker a question, please click in the question part of the control panel and type your question in. You are encouraged to ask at any time during the presentation, but keep in mind that your question may not be addressed until the end of the presentation. The presenter will follow up with any unanswered questions after the webinar concludes. If you are having difficulties hearing or viewing the information, please send a message to the presenter during the webinar so we can recognize if it's an overall problem or if it's an individual's technical issue. If the issue is seen as only occurring with your connection, you will likely be referred to the Citrix support system at the phone number provided. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Eric Gilby. Eric is a landscape industry specialist for Nemetschek Vectorworks, where he utilizes his professional experience and CAD skills to assist in the development, marketing, and sales of Vectorworks landmark software. Eric received an AAS degree in landscape contracting and construction and a BS degree in landscape architecture from The Ohio State University. Eric's unique experience as a practicing landscape architect and user of various CAD programs allows him to help landscape architects and designers develop best practices, including sustainable site design. Eric currently writes and speaks for several green industry associations on digital technology and site design. Please welcome Eric. Eric, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was talking, I guess must have been muted. Well, thank you again, Chrissy, for the introduction, and um, I appreciate the opportunity to present for you all. I've been a participant with APLD since I want to say about 2008, and currently I'm a board director of governance with APLD. And so, if you're new to APLD, I am glad that you're a part with us. If you've been with APLD for a number of years, then you know me probably just as well as many others. So, thanks again for joining me today, and I want to go ahead and get started here. Some of the things that we're going to cover, and get onto the screen. Some of the things we're going to cover today is about the primary benefits of CAD, including areas of efficiency, precision, and quantification, as well as the use of mixed media. We're also going to become aware of the advantages of landscape-specific versus general CAD software. We're also going to become familiarized with presentation and visualization options, and then finding answers to common questions. Now, this is the part that I think most designers hang out for, because one of the things that we found out of this part of the presentation, this comes directly from designers who have given us feedback. And this isn't just feedback for myself. This is feedback from my colleagues at other companies that we are associated with as well for computer design. So this is one of those things where you get to find out from some of the other designers what it was like for them. And then this is another part that comes from that, because many of those designers are going to also share with us what was successful for them in transitioning from hand drawing to CAD workflows. So with that, we'll just go ahead and jump on in. A lot of people ask me what mixed media means when we're talking about the idea of having mixed media and CAD. So imagine if you're coming from hand drawing into a computer aided design environment, oftentimes you're dealing with other kind of media elements, whether you were hand drawing or doing something else in the CAD environment. You'd be dealing with other files such as a plot plan, or maybe pictures from a site, or maybe even pictures from a magazine, or data from a database. Those kind of things can certainly be a part of all of the things that we pull together when we're getting ready to do our designs. And in computer design, this isn't any different. In fact, it's even more important to relate to the kind of file types that you might be dealing with while you're trying to pull your files together. So for example, we're going to see here some examples where we have a PDF on the left, aerial imagery on the bottom, some sketches that we might have created ourselves, images that we want to put in on the plan to kind of help explain plant material, those kind of things, or even bringing in another CAD base file from another application. So these kind of mixed media are all the kind of files that we're starting to deal with, especially once you get into a CAD software program. But one of the benefits of this is the fact that you can deal with all of these different file types. So even if everything was given to you was printed, you could still make use of these by either taking photographs or scanning, or maybe contacting the survey companies for their DWG files, or things like that. But that ability to be able to import those files into your program is going to be extremely important when you're considering a CAD application that is going to help you get your designs done. Precision is another aspect. So when you're dealing with the idea of drawing in CAD versus hand drawing, one of the things that I think people really enjoy out of it is the fact that 4 foot, when you're drawing it by hand versus 4 foot when you're designing in a CAD environment, is that CAD environment is not forgiving in that way. It's not like there's a lot of fudge room, or maybe the thickness of your hand drawn line can, take up some reference in your drawing itself. In CAD, it just isn't that way. So your 4 foot 6 inches is exactly 4 foot 6 inches. There isn't any fudge factor there. So when we're looking at things to be precise, CAD certainly does that. One of the things we see as a benefit for precision is when we're laying out material. So if we want to make sure we know how much space is needed for dimensional paving that seems to be 9 inches wide, and how wide do we need that paving to be if we were going to, or how many paver units do we need if that walkway was going to be, say, close to 4 foot or 4 foot 6? That kind of helps us understand, well, maybe we want to change our overall dimension to something else, because dimensionally those 9-inch increments are going to add up to something else. Dimensioning is another part where we're getting ready to create some layouts, and maybe we want to show people specifically how big or how wide or how long something needs to be. Dimensions are always a part of that CAD environment, no matter what tool you expect to use. So you don't necessarily have to draw your own conventional lines to do it. It's automatically built in, and the precision is there because as soon as you've created a here to there representation for your dimension line, it's giving you that dimensional readout automatically. We also recognize spatial relationships. So that idea of a 4'6" wide pathway in conjunction with how much space is available for, let's say, an overhead trellis, or maybe the spread that we expect on plantings on both sides of the walkway. Is that truly going to allow us that 4'6" opening, or do we have to consider something else for that? So the spatial relationships certainly help to compile what that view is really going to look like when that is said and done. Um, Being able to create base maps with accuracy, I think, is huge for us, because many times the reason why people or designers want to switch over to a CAD environment is specifically to create base plans, because they don't want to do this by hand anymore. So making sure that it's as accurate as you can, the dimension and the angles, it's huge for people when they're creating their base plans. And then being able to provide consistent detailed views. So once you've created a drawing and you need to translate that into an elevation, or you need to translate it into a quick detail of how you expect materials to come together, being able to use that geometry as your friend to help set up what that detailed look is going to be helpful there as well. So there's kind of a balancing act when we talk about efficiency, because we want to make sure that we're producing a quality design. We want to make sure that the cost to produce that design is, kind of kept down, so that, if we're paying someone to get drawings done, or if we're doing them ourselves and our time is valuable, compared to, other things that we could be doing, we want to certainly make sure that that balancing act is taking place, and the speed of how we want to get it taken care of, so we can move on to the next project, or to be able to accommodate another client's special needs at the last minute. All of those aspects that come together really is that balancing act for us. So when we're talking about efficiencies, uh, moving into a CAD environment means that once you've created a base document for your drawing, you don't have to create that base drawing every time you're creating another representation for that project. In fact, that base could be the same base that is used for layout or grading or dimensioning out certain things. We saw the previous drawing looked like it was a demolition plan. Well, that same demolition plan doesn't necessarily have to show up in the next stage when we are proposing things. Moving on to other aspects of the design, you'll be able to see every single part of the design come together, and then with a click of a option to say turn something on or off, you could decide to turn all the plants off at once and turn them back on, turn off the grading, turn off the hardscapes, turn them back on when you need to see them. So some of that ability to control our visibilities is going to be important for us, and probably something we would have not necessarily expected originally when we made a transition from hand drawing to a CAD environment, but it's certainly going to be one of those benefits that we're going to truly cling to once we find out that that option is there for us. Being able to analyze and quantify may be a strong point for some of you, and for some of you maybe not. If you get into more conceptual designs and you hand them off to a contractor, then maybe this is less important. If you're getting into quantifying to meet budgets, this is extremely important. Being able to analyze for square footage, for linear length, for pricing, all that kind of stuff, this is where it gets really important. So just imagine that for a moment, if you're getting ready to draw a shape on your plan that represents a pavered walkway, or maybe a patio space. And you decide to become creative with that patio space, and it involves a lot of angles or maybe curves in it that aren't typically, rectangular. How do we start to estimate for square footage areas? Well, what we recognize is that in a CAD environment, that same shape that you've created immediately knows that information as soon as you've drawn it. It knows its perimeter, it knows its area calculation, and you might decide to dress it up a little bit so it actually looks like that pavered surface area. But ultimately, that geometry still knows inherently how much that area is covered. So this is going to be really important as we see that transition. The geometry really goes to work too when if you're looking at software that incorporates worksheets that help you to tabulate things, that geometry will report to those worksheets. And if you make changes to those shapes, that information gets updated to those worksheets as well. So it's extremely time efficient when you start to get the hang of that idea that that geometry is really going to be your friend when you're starting to do things like estimating and quantifying. So, as you might expect, the changes that you make, once you've updated, you can see the revisions immediately. I was just speaking about this with the worksheets, but it's even true on the object itself. So let's say you created a hardscape and you have a certain shape being specified, but you'd like to know how much area is being covered by the border or how much area is being covered by the field pattern stone. Those kind of pieces of information are automatically updated as soon as that shape is updated. So you can always continue to see the changes based off of those numbers. So one of the things I wanted to get into next is that idea of, so now we know what the general benefits are, but what's the idea of CAD programs out there when I see something that seems to be more general base CAD and others that seem to be landscape specific CAD? And what are the benefits for each of those for me? So one of the things that you'll find is that more readily people talk about general CAD programs like AutoCAD, AutoCAD LT or Lite, BricsCAD, MicroStation, TurboCAD, things like that. These kind of programs, we'll get into here in a second, are not necessarily specific to the landscape. Okay, so you'll find out some of the examples that we'll talk about here in a second. But then the other ones that you're probably used to hearing about are, the product that we talk about most is Vectorworks Landmark. Other products that are out there that are equally as important to recognize are Dynascape, LandFX, LandCAD, ProLandscape. Those are some of those software programs that are really catered to the landscape design side of things and have tools built within them that are specific for our uses. So let's get into this a little bit more. When we're looking at general versus landscape specific programs, the general CAD applications are created with a general design mentality. There isn't anything specific to it, but a designer can customize blocks and hatches to make their designs look exactly how they want them to look. It does take time to kind of get into a CAD program and understand how to use it. But one of the things that you also have to build into that understanding is, how do I get this program that is drawing with lines, shapes, and text to look like the way I did my lines, shapes, and text when I was hand drawing? Because in many cases, those CAD programs weren't designed to think like you already. So you have to find ways to make that those line shapes and text actually look like the way you want it, whether it's line weights, textures, hatches, colors, that kind of stuff. All of that all of those are examples of how a designer might have to work on customizing it. I remember when I first came into the knowledge of a CAD program when I was in college, we were actually shown an example just like this. It was a model of the space shuttle, probably dumbed down, so there weren't proprietary information in that CAD file that allowed people to know how to actually go out and build that space shuttle. But it was a great example of understanding that a general CAD program could design anything. It could design a battleship. It could design a rowboat. It could design a building. It could design a landscape. Those kind of general CAD programs are there to design anything. Maybe even product creations, creating a desktop phone or an attachment for a bolt or something like that. That's what those CAD programs are really there for. When we see the ability to take that kind of program and turn it into something that becomes landscape specific for us, that means we're creating blocks that actually turn those features into something that looks very landscape driven for us, and we just start finding ways to make that work for how we design. One of the things that really drove me crazy about the idea of working in a general CAD environment is the fact that sometimes when you're dealing with other participants' work, so you're pulling in their files and you're drawing over top of it, is that sometimes things can get cluttered, and there isn't really this understanding of how to differentiate your site-specific needs from what you're doing with the rest of the site's needs. So in this example that you see on the screen, the community that this design was created by, and this is a project that I'd created when I was practicing, but this was involving a community house in a subdivision, or I'm sorry, a condo development. And one of the things that we needed to do in this community was when we presented our landscape drawing, we had to make sure that the civil engineer's drawing that was also submitted to the same city was still evident in our plan, so that they knew that we were working off of what they would perceive as the accurate drawings for the site. Well, take a look at this drawing and see how ugly this really looks, because in all intents and purposes, everything that I needed this landscape to show is there, but so is all the other information that has nothing to do with my proposed landscape, other than the fact that it's the base that the civil engineer gave us. So this is one of the things that really kind of drove me crazy about this. But this was at a time when I was still working without knowing that there were landscape specific opportunities for this. Okay, so getting into this realm of landscape-specific functionality, we see the products we were talking about before. And one of the benefits we see is that landscape-specific CAD solutions really do make an obvious benefit because they have objects built in them that are built for us. So, hardscapes are actually in there. Planting objects are actually in there. Line conventions, for property lines or for setbacks, or, the way that we read our lines, so, maybe the field pattern is lighter or not as robust as the edge line is. Things like that that typically are intended for us with those kind of uh, inputs for us. We also see an example here where the line drawings just start to really look a lot better. They look a lot more like the way that we would want them to look, because they are producing drawings with our kind of graphical conventions the way we expected. So, no longer are things starting to be line shapes and text. These are actually symbol objects that are starting to become understood as to what they are and how they're working in our site. So these kind of symbols are available depending on what program you're using. You'll be able to find a palette of symbols of plants, of furniture, of other kind of site objects that you can either drag and drop or make use of, and then start to specify lengths and widths and heights and things like that. These things really make quicker work for us because there's a lot of things we didn't have to start drawing at that point. Now, I don't necessarily need to take away the fun of drawing. That by no means, because some of us who entered this industry decided we wanted to do so because this was kind of our artistic outlet. We wanted to be able to do designs because we enjoyed that process of drawing. And I'm not necessarily trying to make it sound like that there's this need to give up your design ability just to get into these CAD environments. But if you're looking for those kind of efficiencies of pre-built objects that you can make use of, those do exist in landscape-specific function programs. Tools that are built for us, being able to place plants, create a property line, understand how rocks are placed on a site, being able to calculate for parking, being able to show line work that's specific to us. Those kind of tools that are really built for us are tools that are built into those programs. So the result is that we have a more informative plan. So the plan itself has data that's kind of built into these objects. The labels are already present. They're already starting to count objects. When you make changes, they're automatically changed there in your file. You don't necessarily have to erase things and redraw things just to make it happen. You can start getting into conceptualization as well. So it isn't just about that idea. I'll come back to this slide for just a second. When we're getting into this general versus landscape specific, that idea that our end result is more attainable here, but even going into this next step of presentation and visualization is important too, because being able to use these same tools to help make quick work of our presentation drawings or how we're going to conceptualize could certainly be a benefit as well. Maybe you decide you still want to do this by hand. Those kind of processes are still, flexible enough that you can do these things by yourself, by your hand, and then make use of these kind of pieces as you're starting to build those final plans that we were just looking at. But this is really a part that I don't want you to feel cannot be a part of your process. It really can. Being able to conceptualize really can be a part of your process. Being able to do bubble diagrams. Now, imagine being able to do a bubble diagram of how a site's being used and being able to document maybe some preliminary budget figures based on those square footages of how spaces are being used. You're not getting into the nitty gritty yet, but you are starting to figure out maybe this client can't afford to have as much planting beds. Maybe we need to give them more turf areas or vice versa. Maybe the hardscape areas, aren't providing them enough surface area for them to accommodate, their expectations for entertainment. Those kind of things can certainly be figured out through the conceptualization, and the ability to see that take place earlier on in your CAD environment is really important. Okay. We also see an example where visualization can take place in a vertical realm as well. So this is something that I used to do quite a bit. I would turn my plan drawings into vertical or elevation drawings to help us understand what what these drawings would look like, or what these features would look like as a client starting to approach a drawing. It's kind of difficult when we're looking at a plan like this to see, well, what is this going to look like when I'm looking at my house? Because I see this representation and plan, but I'm kind of having a hard time visualizing it. So sometimes we get into translating that into what this is going to look like as an elevation as you're coming into the property, and help the client understand, oh, I understand now where I'm at on my project, and this really helps me understand what this is going to look like. Uh, that's all even made easier with a CAD environment when all you have to do is translate that geometry into an upright form. So you're also looking at images where colorations are key, because sometimes customers cannot read a black and white line drawing to save their soul because it just is lines and shapes and they just don't get it. But as soon as you start implementing some color to it, they start understanding a little bit more about what that space is being filled with, or where the plant's involved, and maybe some expectations for seasonal color might take place because of the things you're showing in your plans. Being able to customize your symbols. This is an example where the user in this design really customized many of the symbols to look the way that their firm really wanted to present many of their drawings. So many of the people who would recognize the work done by this firm would be able to easily figure out this is their style, this is their firm style to understand. And the benefit here is that it's a very appealing style for not only themselves, but also the clients who look at it, because it helps them to understand what's being proposed in their design environment. I think one of the hugest benefits that I found early on in the CAD design stage is this idea that once you've created one thing and you want to kind of create some options for other scenarios, that some of that base drawing information can stay the same while other pieces and parts change. So I think this is going to be really important as you look at options for plans or even elevations like we see here, where those options can really become more efficiently created, so that the client can kind of see the difference between some of these options. And I think we all would admit that there's probably times when we really want to just push one idea out to a client and not really give them a bunch of options, because we'll spend a lot of time on things that really start to pull them down a path that maybe we'd rather them not go down. So those kind of things are really up to you. But if you want to get into options for drawings, CAD makes that a little bit easier. Being able to visualize in 3D is important, because as we're starting to see a lot more customers realizing that 3D visualization is out there, they're going to start expecting that from us. In many cases, I hear that quite a bit, especially from the design build contractors, because in order for them to sell a project, they're recognizing that many other firms that they're competing with are doing this kind of thing. So they have to jump into this 3D visualization side of things as well. Being able to visualize with geometry is very helpful, because many times you want to take that exact geometry that you're figuring out for your layout and turn that into visualized 3D settings. So putting that person into that site with the recognition of what that geometry is translating to into the build environment, I think is pretty helpful. Again, some more telling design. So what we see here on the left is an example of a landscape architect who really takes special interest in making sure that his colorations are exactly what he would have done if he did this by hand. We see on the right-hand side where maybe even touching things up with a photo enhancement software to try to take what looks like a hand-drawn sketch, which is really a CAD drawn view that's been put into a sketch rendering mode, but then other enhancements that are added to it just because he really wants this to look as if it was a hand-drawn plan. So making use of that 3D base work, or what we refer to sometimes as a skeleton, can help be the quicker basis for where we would move next. And then 3D representation continues on when you look at that idea of putting the person in the space, giving them a photorealistic example, what they might be able to expect to see in their project. Now, the thing is, some people are in the process of doing a design and then they'll use another application to model it up once they think they're good and ready. Other people are of the ilk to say, I really want to use 3D from the very beginning because that's how I want to conceptualize. Then I want to turn it into a serious plan drawing when I feel I'm good and ready with the designs that I've created. So there's kind of a mix that can go either way, but one or the other, I think that visualization effort is going to be important. So there's companies, this one is from California, that really created a strong representation on the same page with not only their colored graphics in their plan, a 3D view that shows the representation of the space that they were designing, but also some of that precedent images that helps them convey to the client, this is the kind of paving we're talking about. This is the kind of planning material we're talking about. This is the kind of signage we were expecting. This is the kind of views or maybe the shade production that we would see on a project. Maybe even including those legends like the evergreen and the deciduous and ornamental trees right there on the same plan becomes very easy for the customer to understand what they're looking at without having to look at another page to understand it, or going from a printed page to 3D images that are found on a computer. All of this can be placed in the same view environment on the same sheet. Being able to take customers into the site isn't necessarily a still thing either. I remember when I first took an APLD held course on SketchUp where we were designing. We took a design that was already created, we modeled it up into a 3D environment, and then created a walkthrough. And so examples like, didn't mean to move that. Examples like this allow us to take the customer on a tour of this site that we've just designed. Keep it going here. So a customer can very quickly understand, when I'm in this site, this is what it's going to look like. Or when I'm in this site, the solar animation is going to help me understand where the sun and shade is being placed throughout that day. So I think from that example of understanding not only just that ability to walk through a project, to be able to take the client directly into that file and move them around in there and back them up or turn their head to the right or whatever, all of these techniques of being able to visualize what you're representing is going to be huge, because now the client knows more than ever what it's going to be like in their proposed drawing. If that scares you to be able to show a client, that much specificity and the materials that you're presenting, maybe you want to make those 3D presentations more hand rendered looking, or pen and line work oriented and less photorealistic. That's certainly a true thing. So, and that can happen in many of the 3D visualization softwares where you don't necessarily need to get it photorealistic to understand exactly what materials you're talking about. You want it to be more form and function related, and we'll talk about materials later. I just want to get you to understand what this space is going to look like. These are some of the conversations you can have with clients when you're showing them different varieties of 3D views. So we're getting into the point where a lot of people start to think about, yeah, but this is one of the reasons why I kind of haven't jumped into a CAD environment. So one of the things that we're going to talk about here is this idea of the cons, the pros and the cons. This is the part about why would I not want to come into a CAD environment if I'm coming from hand drawing. Many designers first put out there the fact that there's a learning curve. I don't really have time to learn new software. I understand learning this piece of software takes a lot of time, and maybe I need to wait till winter to be able to accomplish that. Well, people in California don't have that choice. People in South Texas or in Florida don't have that choice. But that idea that, when do I take the time to stop what I'm doing and learn a new technique just so that I can become more efficient in something in the next stage. So when we address comments like this, things that we've found, from examples of other designers is that every designer learns differently. So one of the things that we recommend is to figure out what your learning style is and then try to pick a training method that really benefits you the most, because you might decide, well, because I can do this by videos, I think I'll enjoy learning this better. Or I really enjoy being in a classroom setting and having an instructor in front of me. So from that perspective, I don't think this would be as bad as I thought. Designers, you're always going to recognize the areas that you want to benefit from CAD. And so maybe that's the specific areas that you ask for training on. So someone might come to me and say, Eric, I really want to learn just how to create my base maps. I want to do hand drawings after that, but I just want to start doing base maps in the program. Can you show me how to do that? Those kind of training opportunities, I think, are really helpful, because then you don't feel like you have to take everything in at once, or you don't have to bite more off than you can chew. You might also recognize that there's other programs out there that kind of help you understand that realm of digital design without really taking you down that CAD path until you're good and ready for it too. So other programs like photo imaging software, Sketch, or 3D modeling, these all can be programs that can give you a head start. So the next thing that we hear a lot from designers who were thinking about it, but then they kind of decide not to, is this idea of cost. It definitely is going to cost you something more to do something with a CAD environment than doing things by hand, because by hand you have a certain amount of equipment that you always be using for hand drawings. And in CAD, you've got a computer, you've got the software, you've got a monitor, you've got surge protector, you've got a desk, you've got all these kind of other things that need to go along with the fact that besides the fact that I'm doing this design in a CAD environment, I need all these other kind of infrastructure to make that possible. So one of the things we found is that sometimes when you're looking at standalone programs, you might find that they're cheaper, and that those actually require the programs that actually require plugins or things that make a general application, a general CAD application, landscape specific, will make those more expensive. So one of the things we always recommend is take a look at the software options out there and try to find out what options are there for you for the times when you want something that is standalone software that you don't need 10 other things just to make that software do its thing. General cost range that people start to find is it's somewhere between $1,500 to $3,000, and you can count yourself as a CAD license owner. Now, the one thing that we would recommend is that um, don't necessarily look at all software equally handed when you're looking at pricing, because sometimes the pricing is based on specific modules that you need to do dot dot dot, and if you aren't comparing apples to apples for what that dot 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 is, you might be looking at a different price point. So what we always recommend is find out what the similarities are for the functionality you expect to use, and then make your comparisons from there. Seeking discounts. This is one of the things I always recommend to people, is that, if you're looking to get training at the same time that you're getting ready to buy your software, ask the salesperson, is there a way that I can put the two purchases together and get a bundle price? The thing that we always recognize is that you'll never find out what you can get if you don't ask. So always ask for the discounts. They might come back and say there's no discounts, it is what it is. Or they might come back and say, no, actually we have a promotion running right now, and this is what the promotion is. So if you don't ask for discounts, you probably won't get them. If you do ask for them, don't get ticked off because they didn't show them to you to begin with. Sometimes the salespeople might just be hoping for the sale to occur at that price, but if it means that you're going to be able to get a sale out of it, don't be afraid to ask for that discount and see what happens. So time-intensive transition is another thing. We just talked about the learning curve, and this is kind of part of that story, but not completely. So when we talk about time-intensive transition, the idea is that maybe you only want to use CAD to do your base plans. We were just talking about this. Um, what we always recommend is that if you're looking for this ability to transition gradually, then only take on a few things at a time and then work your way through mastering the rest of them. I can tell you when I first started working in a CAD environment, I started doing a entry feature for a community in Ohio, and it was involving brick columns and wrought iron fencing in between, and it was going to be involving a sign blank, for the entry part for this community. And the one thing that I was starting to do is starting to create bricks um, graphically, the shapes of a brick to kind of emulate what it would look like in my column. And then, it took me quite a bit of time to fill not just that column, but the other column and then the lower wall area where the fence was going to be sitting up above, things like that. And then a year later, I'm not necessarily saying that project took a year, it's not, but a year later on another project, I found out that there was this thing called a hatch command, which meant that in a blink, as quick as you can snap your fingers, uh, your shape has now been filled with brick patterns. Well, imagine how much time I would have saved in my process of learning the software if I had just gone through training to figure out that hatch command existed. So even though we can laugh about it on the other side, it's really one of those things that just aggravates you when you are working through the software that you're trying to learn, and you're trying to do it on your own, and you don't feel like you're getting everything, you're not being efficient, and then next thing you know, someone introduces you to those tools that makes life easier. Don't be afraid to get into those at the beginning, because that is really going to make your whole process much more efficient, and you didn't have to get frustrated to begin with. Making template files is important, because sometimes when you're creating files that from one file to the next, these things that you included in one will always be present in others. It's going to look different on a different site. But I know that my grass is going to look like this, or I know that my plant symbols are always going to be looking like this, and I always want them to be pre-labeled and pre-named. Setting up templates with all of that in place means the next time you start a project, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just pick it up and run with it. Time saved in labeling. This is another thing, is that even though it's going to take you some time to transition into the CAD, imagine the efficiency, imagine the time that will be saved once you've learned all of these processes, and you know that it takes you less time to get plants labeled than it did when you were doing it by hand. It's going to be taking you less time to do plant counts than it was when you did them by hand. Hatching is going to take far less time than it did when you're doing it by hand. So all of these efficiencies are going to start to compound, and you're going to start to realize, man, why didn't I do this sooner? Because there's really this big benefit of time saved by being able to transition into a CAD environment. And one of the last cons that we're going to address here is this idea of hand-drawn appeal. When customers talk about going from hand drawing to CAD, they most generally will say, I really like the idea of doing hand drawings or hand renderings. Is there a way that I can still do that while I'm doing other things in CAD? And that's true. You certainly can, but also pay attention to the fact that some of these programs offer visibility controls that allow you to make your drawings look like they're hand drawn. So maybe there's some aspects that looks very contrived or very CAD drawn, but if you put a sketch rendering on it, or you use hand rendered texture fills on your objects, you can very quickly start to understand, well, this doesn't look as bad as I thought. This really may be better, or maybe saves me from taking the time to hand render drawings. I'm not saying that's the case with everybody. Some people are very particular about their graphics, and they really want it to look like they did it by hand. And so, for all intents and purposes, that's still a good plan to go by. Being able to get those sketch styles, even on specific details. Notice in this pergola here where the overlapping lines are, and how that relates to the overall scheme. And when you go further in the distance, how loose it becomes. So each of these pieces and puzzles, or pieces of the puzzle, comes together to help make this overall design look a lot more cohesive, because you're able to control some of these visibilities that way. Being able to hand draw or hand color right over top of your CAD drawing totally can happen. That's actually what I did in my last job. Was every time I created drawings and they had to be colored, I would hand draw right over top of them, or hand render right over top of them. That's totally possible. Um, and one of the things that I'd note, if you are going to hand render right over top of it, you want to be able to, I'll pull back to this other drawing here, you want to be able to see clearly in your symbols. So be clean and efficient about your symbols if you know you're going to come in and hand render over top of it. Don't put a lot of line work in it that will eventually smear when you're doing the colorations. And then once you've done your colorations, you can scan them to continue to have digital renditions of what you have, so you can forward those to the clients, but you can still maintain your hand-drawn original somewhere else. And then this one I wanted to show because one of the examples that someone actually just asked me about, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks ago, almost a month ago now, when I was in Portland, this idea of being able to take drawings that I've created and how can I use a drawing that I've created by hand in CAD. So maybe everything else, it looks like in this example where part of the base was drawn in a CAD environment, they did the rest of the landscape plan by hand, but now they want to pull back into a CAD environment to help them quantify. Is that possible? Most certainly. So you'll see this example where these shapes are being traced so that the quantification can take place for some of these planting beds. So don't hesitate to do any of these workflows. If it works for you, by gosh, just do it, because if you want to create your base plan in CAD, hand draw over top of it, bring it back into CAD to do your quantifications, and that's exactly how you want it to work. I'm all for it. If you want to find other ways to make CAD continue on from there, and then maybe you wouldn't necessarily do hand drawing, that's fine too. It's really a benefit to understand that there's flexibility in the way that you can adapt. So some of the benefits and best practices as kind of put forth from some of our designers who've given us feedback is that you really can continue in the favored workflows that you've created to begin with. So don't give up the things you really, really like about landscape design. If that means that when you transitioned over to a CAD program means that you give up something you really enjoyed, if it's something that really takes the love out of the process, put it back. Do the things that you really want to continue to do, but look for the areas in those workflows that can really help you in the areas that you really didn't favor. Look for the opportunities to fix those processes or to make things easier, to make things more enjoyable as you're transitioning, because once you found those areas where things become more enjoyable, you're going to start building on top of that for the other aspects that you weren't really expecting. Base plan creation is one of those examples. So notice this idea here. We see a PDF file that's been brought into the program. We lay it out in a certain aspect. We start tracing over top of it. Next thing you know, we've got our base plan. So this is one of those aspects where it really helps us to see that transition from these digital files that we needed to pull in and start creating a base plan. I can't tell you how many times I used to get on people's cases in my last job where they would stand at a copy machine and take those plot plans and enlarge them so that they could become the size that they need for the hand drawing that they were about to do. I mean, all they really had to do was pull that file into their CAD program, scale it up there, print it out, and they saved so much more time from even just standing there at the dang copy machine and taping and doing all that kind of stuff. By all means, pull it into that CAD program and make your base plan there and then move on. Edits and revisions. Watching this plan where we show one example and then another where we want to see what it looks like if overhead planting's present in this plan. I don't have to recreate my drawing just to show that. All I'm doing is adding a few more aspects that change the look at this. And if I wanted to go back to what it looked like before, it's just a click away. So I have that ability to show these options as revisions to be able to say, oh, you want to be able to disguise some of the views into your house, or you don't want to be able to look from your bedroom into the street. Let's put some upright trees in there that kind of help visually screen that area so that happens. And this is now what it's going to look like. This idea too that maybe we've got an example where we're looking at planting that shows ornamental trees on both sides, and we've got a pool house on the left and an accessory open air structure on the right, but visually it looks like we're mimicking the treatment on the left that we have on the right. But ultimately, we can say, well, we can also vary that up a little bit by placing in maybe a shade structure and then more seating area and less consistency with what's going on the left-hand side with what's going on the right-hand side. Those kind of things are really things that help a customer understand that you put more thought into this project that gives them the ability to see visually what those changes might look like if they change their mind. Being able to tabulate information just by dragging a worksheet into your plan. Seeing that information calculate almost immediately is going to be huge. This is one of the things that I think really helps pull landscape designers into this aspect is that the quantification efforts themselves get done in a blink. And then another example where we see all three pieces, the plan, the 3D view, and the budget, this budget of the worksheets being shown for plantless and hardscapes and landscape areas. Okay, there's other areas that are coming down the path, and maybe some of you have already taken a look at this. I would say that these devices have always been out there for a number of years, but that's tablets. So one of the things that I think a lot of people really enjoy is that idea of holding a pen in their hand or holding something that is drawing in their hand and being able to put that on their digital device as a direct input into their CAD application. So we recognize that this can still take place for people, whether you're doing it on something that's held upright like we see in these pictures, or maybe you have your tablet down on a table like you would if it was a piece of paper. That process of being able to put pen to paper, or in this case, pen to tablet, to be able to create your designs, that doesn't go away if you really want that technology to support you in doing that. So don't be afraid to ask for those kind of options as well. If you're looking into a CAD application, you can just come right out and say, does your application allow me to use a pen and tablet? That's something that I would definitely want to encourage you to do if you wanted to maintain those workflows. Okay, so I'm going to get through the questions here in a second, but before I do, I really wanted to kind of give some credence and some acknowledgments to the sources of the information that you saw in here, besides the fact that, this was information that you saw generated from our behalf. We also pulled in information from Dynascape. So at that time, Len Hordick was working at Dynascape, and I got a lot of information from him then. I still get information from the people at Dynascape now. Joe Salemi has taken kind of the role that Len was in, and then he and I, really do continue to exchange information on other aspects. We co-present, we've written articles, things like that, and so it's really beneficial to get information on an updated basis from other collegial companies that we deal with. But we also had information incorporated in here from designers like we discussed, Dana Perone of Ellen Haga Landscape Designs, and Ken Bates, and again, Len Hordick, who was also a designer from his own aspect, and then some of the input that he received from people who were transitioning into Dynascape as well. So, and I also want to thank APLD for allowing you guys to have a presentation like this again, and also to thank you for joining us. Now, Chrissy, I was planning on going ahead and addressing questions. Is that okay for me to still do that, or do you have some remarks before we address questions?
It is more than fine. You're more than welcome to answer the question.
Okay, so let me do that. And I'll pull up some of the questions that have come in. And, the thing about doing live presentations is it's really hard to kind of take a look at questions while we're trying to get the thought across. But I did note where many of these questions were asked. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that I answer the question in the context of when it was posted. Robert Kazam was asking what program has those kind of arrows and dash lines, etc. The one that you were looking at was that conceptual program or conceptual line work, and those kind of line work was available within software. I'm going to say you could do those in other visualization software too, but the example you saw was from Vectorworks, but other programs like Photoshop or Illustrator could take care of those as well. But being able to create your custom line types within there and using that in your templates is going to be the easiest way to see that happen. Arrow styles, can also happen in many of those programs. So if in our case specifically, we call them markers, but they're really just leader heads or arrowheads or whatever you want to call them. Those really are available in many other programs as well. Sometimes they're incorporated with the line itself, and sometimes they're things that you add on to the line just to make them look like they're consistent. Uh, but yes, those certainly can happen in many different types of uh, visualization software packages. Let's see. Mary Beth is asking, I'm not sure I understand completely. Are landscape specific programs add-ons to CAD or completely separate programs? That's a great question, Mary Beth. So there are CAD applications, and we mentioned some of the examples like AutoCAD and AutoCAD LT, Bentley, Bricks CAD, PowerCAD, TurboCAD. Those programs are general. There's nothing landscape specific about them by themselves. What we end up seeing is that um, you have the ability to get other add-on programs to make those general programs CAD specific or landscape specific. So, for example, if you're using AutoCAD and you want to make it landscape specific, you could get LandCAD or Eagle Point. Uh, you could get Land Effects. Those are two examples of plugins that make AutoCAD become a landscape specific functionality for you. But the other thing that we were talking about was the standalones, something like a Dynadscape or Vectorworks that were really purpose built for just doing landscape designs, and you don't need another program to make them landscape specific. So I'm hoping that answers your question in the way that you asked it. But really, it's the idea that there are plugins available to make general become landscape specific, and then there's landscape specific that are just standalone. Let's see. Is there a source that shows a side-by-side comparison of various products? Kelly, I'll tell you one of the best. I'm not sure exactly where you're from, so maybe if you help me understand where you're from, I'll give you some hints on there. But ultimately, if you go to trade shows, you're going to obviously see many of those companies in the same trade show, and you can gather information from them right there in the same trade show. For example, if you went to the APLD conference this year, you're going to see people from Dynadscape. You're going to see people from Vectorworks there. You would also, I can't remember if they were planned on for this year, but in a previous year, there was a company there called Vizterra. So those kind of programs do try to um, populate the trade show exhibit areas like that. And I think that that's probably one of those examples where you're really going to get that right at the same time comparison. Go to each booth and really have those conversations with those people. When you find out something from one vendor and you want to go to the next one and say, okay, so what do you do about this that I just now learned about? And then find out from them and then take your notes, because by all means, it's certainly helpful to do that. There was a time a few years ago when an online social media program called Land8 did a night by night comparison, not necessarily comparison, but presentation series where they had each CAD solution, for a few different vendors, present each night. Those kind of things don't happen a lot, but they certainly can happen. So I guess, just paying attention to those examples. But other things you can do is go to sources like LinkedIn or other forums where they do have that discussion. Land8's another example, but going to those kind of forums and finding out what people are saying. What kind of program are you using? Why do you like it? I know that APLD has that discussion almost on a regular basis. You could go into the discussions on the LinkedIn APLD discussion page and see designers talking directly about that. And even before you pose a question, I always recommend to go through and read what people have said first. And if you still have questions, posing questions, because the people who are using those products would definitely chime in and tell you what they're finding. Let's see. Lindsay says, thanks, Eric. I sketch concepts by hand, but later on I'm doing planting plans, base maps, etc. in CAD. She's wondering if we can find the right time during the design process to move from hand sketches to CAD. Sometimes she moves to CAD too soon and too short, and it sort of narrows down the concept refinement. Okay, so Lindsay, I guess, that's one of those things where I would say if you've already identified that maybe you move over to CAD a little too soon. I can imagine how that happens because maybe you're coming up with sketches and you're thinking, "Ooh, I wish I could use that polyline tool that gives me this fluid line type while I'm doing this, because I know that I'm going to be more accurate when I do it." If you really are trying to do things by hand and come up with those concepts by hand, don't be afraid to stick with the methods that you really want to stick with for as long as you can, then make that transition. I can tell you now that I've been in CAD for many years now, beginning with AutoCAD and now with Vectorworks, the thing that I find the hardest about going back to hand drawing is all of the conventions I'm so used to doing by a digital device that now has become easier for me to do than to go back and try to do it by hand because I'm just so used to it. That doesn't mean that I still don't find that same artistic connection between my mind and the mouse or my mind and the pen and tablet. That still occurs, but it's just happening through the digital device instead of through the ink and the lead on the pencil. So my recommendation is that if there's parts of that process that you really want to cling to, just cling on to it until you're good and ready and then scan it. If you felt like you went over too fast, go back to the drawing board and continue and then get rid of what you had before and then pull it back in when you're ready. I don't know. I guess the one part that I would say is that you probably would like to get your base plan created first, print it, do your hand drawings, scan that part, and then bring it back in. The benefit out of doing that is that your image now has representations that show up both from your hand drawings and into your CAD drawings. Like the property line, you can easily match up if you needed to make sure that it was scaled right. Trying to do sketches without that background that is exactly the same as what you have in your drawing becomes a little bit more chancier. Things don't exactly line up the same. So I always recommend that you take a look at it that way. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so Kelly, knowing that you're from Seattle, I was trying to think what events go on out there. I know the Northwest show takes place, and you might be able to find some comparisons out there. I was actually just in Portland and Seattle a few weeks ago, and we did a discussion almost just like this when I was in Portland for the APLD chapter out there. So, those kind of examples do happen. Being able to pick our brains anytime you have a chance, by all means, don't be afraid to pick up the phone and talk to the people like myself or Joe at Dynascape or some other company, and just pick our brains about what makes you different and what can I compare, and do that because we respect each other. We think that each other has great products, and if there's things about that other product that we find you would benefit better from, we won't hesitate to let you know that. So don't hesitate to give us that time to ask us those questions if you do. Let's see. Karen's asking, what robust landscape CAD program is the least expensive? What's the difference between Dynascape and Vectorworks? Well, I told Chrissy that I wasn't going to get into pricing, and I'm not going to get into pricing in this conversation because this is really about being non-proprietary. But I can tell you from the ones that you've asked about that the price is very similar. It didn't used to be that similar, but now they're really not that far in price from each other, but I would still convince you to check the apples to apples comparison. For the aspects that you really want to get out of that drawing, make the comparisons from there first. If you find that everything is pretty similar from that aspect, then look at the opportunities, things that you're not necessarily expecting. What are the opportunities with that software comparison? And then maybe you make your decision from there. The one thing I can still tell you is that even there isn't going to be a base price and that's just it. There's going to be a base price and then things that turn into a different price if you add other things to it. And that's the case with just about any application you're looking at. So just pay attention to what happens if I have this and what happens if I add that. Okay, now other vendor, what happens if I have this kind of functionality that I seem to be able to get with this other vendor? What would you be able to do to make that happen? And just do your comparison that way. It's totally understood that you should do that. I mean, don't even begin to hesitate to ask those salespeople from those companies you're looking at to really make those comparisons based on the functionality you need and what you would expect to get into. Let's see. What size monitor do you recommend? Debbie, that's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that during one of these presentations. I find a 20 to 21-inch monitor to be sufficient. If you went to something smaller, don't go smaller than 17 inches. You're just going to be on a laptop any smaller than that. But if you're looking for a monitor itself, I think 20 to 21 is pretty good. But like the iMacs, let's say if you're looking at an iMac computer, I think some of those got even bigger to like 27 inch or maybe bigger. I don't know. I can't remember what the numbers are, but 20 to 21 I think is pretty favorable, and you can go up from there. Okay. Lindsay's saying, is there a big learning curve of switching from one product to another? Not huge. I would say that if you've been in if you've been in one product, I mean, her question is asking about switching from Vectorworks to Dynadscape. Is there a big learning curve? I would say as long as you've been in a CAD application, you've mastered getting over that hurdle first. It's just a matter of being able to do the same thing with a different tool or a different name to that tool. It's not going to be that huge of a change. So I would suggest for you that if you're looking for that ability to transition, to just look to see what the capabilities are, what are they called, how differently are they named, do I have more clicks involved or do I have less clicks to be able to achieve the same things I was doing one program to another? Yeah, I would totally recommend taking a look at that idea of going from one program to another. A lot of people have asked me going from a general CAD application like AutoCAD into a landscape specific program. And even then, I tell you the same thing, because a lot of the times the things that you're doing in your new program are based off of what you were already doing in your general CAD program. So it's just a matter of finding out the new way of doing it. Okay, well, we are right up to the time when we started. So I appreciate everybody's questions. Chrissy, do you have more comments that you want to bring?
Well, thank you so much, Eric, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our attendees today. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today as well. For our attendees, please note that within the next 10 days, you will receive an email with a link and instructions on how to download a copy of the webinar file. Please be sure to check your spam folder, as emails can sometimes end up there. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, too.